Hey there, I'm your host Lasawi, and this is part 7 of the inventory system series. In the last episode, we covered transfer slots, and in today's video, we'll focus on containers. And with that said, let's begin. Let's begin by going into our content drawer, and over here, we want to create a display, but for our containers. So it'll be very similar to our player display. So the easiest way would be to duplicate this. So let's do that and change the name player to container. Now once inside, we're presented with one inventory, but we need two. One for the player and one for the container. And the container's inventory will be slightly different because it's not going to include a hotbar. So back in our content drawer, let's duplicate our inventory widget, calling it the container inventory. Let's open this up and click on the sizebox underscore hotbar, delete it, click on the sizebox underscore inventory, and switch this top padding from 215 to 120. And let's compile and save. And back in our container display, what we want to do is search for our container inventory, drag it into our canvas panel, and inside here we'll have it on the opposite side of our player inventory. Let's reset these. I'll have an offset of -60 on the X. On the size X, I'll have a 710, just like with the player's inventory, and the size will be 680 for the simple reason we removed the hotbar. For the alignment, I'll have this at 1, and for this, I'll have it at 0.5. And there we go. Now in the event graph, we have a few sound effects that are playing when we're opening and destroying it, but we will have some container sound effects as well. So these might get messy. So for the moment, I'll simply break the pin just in case I want to add them later on. Now, when we construct this, at the moment, it's only constructing the player's inventory. But we also want to construct our container inventory. So to do that, let's drag this out and let's do refresh inventory. Now the inventory in question, we will do a promote to variable, calling it the container inventory. Put it in here. And what we can do with this is instance editable and exposed and spawn. Now, inside of our onKeyDown event, we are closing this inventory with either the I key or the tab key. Now, that's okay, but I want to have two more options. I want to be able to close this with either my I tab key, and I want to be able to close it with my interaction key, which is the E key for me. And perhaps we also want the escape key. Now, in our OR, let's add this. So that means any of these buttons will be able to close our inventory. Compile, save, and let's exit. Next, let's go ahead and open up our player HUD. So content, third person, UI, player HUD. Now, inside of our event graph, just like we have created the player display, we're going to create a container display, but not as a custom event, but as a function. So do create container display. From here, we'll do create widget. This will be our container display. Let's pass in our container inventory into there. From here, we'll promote this to a variable wb underscore container display. Next, let's go ahead and add this to viewport. And lastly, we want to return a value, and the value we want to return would be this one here. And let's also reroute this to make it more obvious. And I'm happy with this. So compile, save, and we can also exit the player HUD. Next, let's go ahead and create some containers. So in our inventory system, let's create a new folder for our containers. And inside, let's create a blueprint class, actor, BP underscore container underscore base. Now let's open this up. Inside this, we want to add a static mesh. And because of how my containers are made, I have a bottom base and a top base. I'll be adding a second mesh, but I'll be adding this within the first one. So drag that into it. And let's also rename it to second mesh. Now, this also needs to have some collision on it. So let's select our first mesh. The second mesh doesn't really matter, but our first mesh, let's do collision, custom. And like we did on the overlap sphere, we had the interactive blocked. So we're going to do it the same here. For the second mesh, I'll actually turn collision off. So no collision at all. Compile and save. And we can add our models into here. So find your models and add them. For me, I believe it's called a chest. There we are. That's the base. And for the second mesh, if I look for chest once again, I get the chest top. And simply drag that into position like so. So the way the animation of this will work, I'll have this rotating like this to 120 degrees. And we can set that up with a simple timeline. Next, let's go into our event graph. And inside here, we want to add a few variables. First, let's begin by adding a container content variable, which will be of type item slot. And this will be an array, instance editable and expose and spawn. Next, let's add a integer, which will be the container size. This will be a integer and single, instance editable and exposed on spawn. Now we can get rid of event tick and the overlap events. We are only interested on event begin play. Let's also go ahead and add a component for our inventory. We can then get this and do set slots. And whatever we put in there will be what's displayed. And that will be our container content. Next, let's do get slots. So we can also resize it and plug in our container size there. And let's compile, save. And next, let's go into our class settings and let's add the blueprint interface inside. So when we're looking at this item, that's displayed on our focus target. So drag this out. And the message we can do is format message. And if we promote this to a variable called the container name, make this instance editable and exposed and spawn, we can then do on the format by disconnecting it, a search space curly brackets container curly brackets and hit enter. So now when we look at it, it'll search and then it'll be checking for what name it should use. Let's compile and save. Next, let's go ahead and create a child of this container base because we won't be using this one. This is just a parent for our general code. Create child blueprint class. Now this one we can call chest. And just like this one, we won't really touch anything in here for now. But what we can do is we can place it in our world somewhere. So we'll get an idea of how it looks like. And if we hit the play button, let's see what happens. At the moment, we just get the search. But if we click on our chest and we go to details, we can see the container name. And let's give it a name chest. Container size of, let's say, 20. And let's give it some content. Won't be present just yet, but container item quantity, let's do 1 or 2. And for the item ID, if I remember, 1B1. So save that And if we hit play, there we go, search chest, but we can't open it. So the content is actually there, but we just can't open it. So in order to be able to open it, we want to go back into our inventory system, blueprint component inventory. And on interact, is not valid. We want to interact with this actor. So what we're going to do is, I have this actor handy here, get actor, and do a interact message. The interactor is still ourselves. And we also want to add one more piece after this. And this will be for our animations. So copy that and do interact on interact. And this will basically tell the container, okay, we've interacted with it, do a certain event. Compile, save, and let's go back into our container base, not the child. Let's close that so we don't make any mistakes. And in the event graph, we want to create some more variables, such as we want the variable to know if it's open. So is open, which will be a simple Boolean. And we can also make this instance editable and exposed on spawn. Next, it would be a good idea to add a container sound effects, but we don't yet have the sound effects structure. So let's go into our containers and I'll make a separate folder for this, or don't need to actually. I already have a sound effects folder, containers. So let's go in the chest container, create a structure for this, s underscore container, contained, apparently container sound effects. And inside, we will do a sound base and two sounds, an open sound and a closed sound. With that, save, exit, head back into your container base and change the type to be S container sound effects. There we go. And let's also make this instance editable and exposed on spawn. So if we head back outside and click on this container, we can now set the container sound effects. So on open, I can search for this, open chest, and we have our close chest. Perfect. Next, we want to go into our container display. So UI, container display. Now in here, we want an event dispatcher to notify us when the container has been closed just before we remove it from the parent. Now it looks like I already have an on container close dispatcher. I don't remember creating it. Maybe I did, but let's delete it. Let's create a new one on container closed. And let's add it. Let's call it just before we remove from the parent. And we can compile and save. Next, let's head back into our container base. And in the interfaces channel on interact, we want to get player controller like so, and do a cast to BP my controller. And from here, I'm going to get my player HUD. And I want to do a create container display, just like so. And when we've created it, I want to do the container inventory, by the way, is going to be this. I want to bind my event dispatcher, which we created here, on this. So we'll do bind event on container closed. So once we've opened it, or once we've interacted with it, it's going to listen to this event. And in here, we'll create a matching event, and let's call this update animation or update container. whatever you like. Now in the base, we won't have anything happening, but we'll create some code in our child. So I believe that's everything here. Let's compile and save, and let's open up our child blueprint. So containers, container chest. In here, we want the onInteract event. So double click on that. Let's get rid of event tick and begin overlap. We don't need those, but we do need that there. That's very important. So let's get a branch and do is open. And the reason I have the access to this is because it's a child blueprint and the variable exists in the parent. Let's do a not boolean. So this is, if this is not true, we're going to set is open to be true. And if it is false, we're going to leave it false. Or if it is true, we're going to make it false. Then I also want to get my update container event we made in our parent, and we're calling not the function, we want the event. So on event dispatcher, it's going to run this code again once the container closes. Next, let's do our sound effect. So we have access to container sound effects. There we go. And I want to break this open to get the open and close sound, and we'll do play sound at location. Plug that into there and create a copy like so. Even make this a little more better in my eyes. And open goes here, close goes there. Now the location will be get actor location. Simple as that. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want a timeline. So add timeline. And let's call this the container timeline. Go inside and set this length to be whatever you want. I'll have it on 1 second. Create a track, add a float track, call it the container track, perhaps, does not matter. Right click, do a add key to curve float, set both these values to 0, enter, 0 and enter. Right click again, add key to curve float. Now these values, the time will be 1 and the value will also be 1. Hit enter after inputting those values because sometimes they don't save for me. So once you hit enter, you should be good. Let's compile that, exit, and on here we'll do play, and on close we'll do reverse. Now on the container track, we'll do a lerp, but this value we'll put into the alpha. So control and drag to switch the pin. And next, let's get our second mesh, since this is the mesh that's going to be animated. And we'll do set relative rotation. There we go. And it got the variable for me anyways. So on update. And let's break this open. To know this value, go inside and simply rotate this. And we can see that on the X, red is the X, green is the Y, and Z is the Z, X, Y, Z. This is rotating if it is closed. And now I open it, it goes to 120. And I know this is on the X channel. So in here, we'll do minus 120, and we'll plug this into the X channel. Now, if I go ahead and compile everything, and we can test it perhaps. So let's go ahead, press the E key. I get the sound effects. We can open the container. And what happens if I close it? Boom, all works. And that's great. Let's also see if we can interact with these items. So it lets me drag them. I can split them. I can use them. Drop doesn't work yet, and inspect doesn't work yet. That's perfect. Can we drag that? into our own inventory? Yes, we can. Let's collect some cubes and see some further action. So perhaps I want to split it, drag some in there, works fine, split, drag, works just fine. So we're all good. So this will be it. In the next video, we'll cover the item slider. I hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. And as always, happy developing.